Time-lapse mode. Let's swipe our screen to the right to get into time-lapse mode. You can see the stopwatch icon in the upper middle part of the screen, indicating that we are in time-lapse mode. To the right of that, we have our battery power indicator. On the opposite side, we have our remaining capture time, determined by our current settings and the size of our micro SD card. Digital lenses shortcut. Like in the video and photo modes, we have the W icon, which is the digital lenses shortcut. It's currently on wide, hence the W. Touch zoom shortcut. If we want to digitally zoom into our shot, we can go from 1x to 2x. Time-lapse presets. The large button is a time-lapse preset. Let's tap it to see all of the time-lapse presets. There are 3. First, we have TimeWarp. TimeWarp allows you to record incredibly stabilized time-lapse videos while you move the camera. This example shows what I'm talking about. Next, we have time-lapse. Time-lapse is the technique of taking a sequence of images at set intervals to record changes that usually take place slowly over time. Then those frames are played back in succession, and the scene that is normally slow in reality is sped up and happens in a much shorter time. Think of dramatic clouds flying through the sky, for example. We also have night lapse, which is time-lapse taken in low light. It allows the camera to go into slow shutter speeds to capture objects like moving stars. If we scroll down, we see the plus symbol if we want to create our own custom time-lapse preset. Time-lapse settings. Let's adjust and explain some of the time-lapse settings. First, I'm going to adjust the resolution. I'm going to switch to 4K because it's a higher resolution than 1080. Next, let's go to Format. You can either select time-lapse video or time-lapse photo. Let's break down these two options. Time-lapse video simply records your time-lapse and puts it into one video file. It's the easiest of the two formats to use. Time-lapse photo is different. Instead of recording your time-lapse to one video file, it records each frame as an individual photo. So instead of a single video clip, you might end up with hundreds of photos. You will have to deal with these photos later using a computer and editing software. I'll demonstrate this later. For the highest quality but most labor-intensive time-lapses, I suggest shooting in time-lapse photo mode and set your output setting to RAW. Remember, RAW is powerful because it gives you a lot of control over your image after it's been shot. Interval. The next setting I want to discuss is interval. Interval refers to how often your camera takes a photo when shooting time-lapse. It goes from 0.5 seconds to 60 minutes and many intervals in between. Here's a chart with some interval suggestions. These are only suggestions. Feel free to experiment. Time-lapse is beautiful to look at, but time-consuming to shoot because it takes a lot of frames shot over extended periods of time to make a substantial time-lapse shot. Duration. The next setting is duration. You can record with no time limit, and the camera just records time-lapse until the media card is filled up or until the battery dies. Or you can pick a limit up to 3 hours. Scheduled capture. With scheduled capture, you can set a time for your GoPro to start recording a time-lapse in the future. After you set a time, you can turn off your camera and the GoPro will turn on and begin recording at the time you set, which is a great feature. It saves battery life and lets the GoPro do the work while you can be doing something else. You can cancel the scheduled capture by just turning it off. Bitrate. As always, I'll set my bitrate to high for the best quality recording. EV Comp. I'll bring EV Comp down to -1 so that my image is not overexposed. When set to its default setting, the GoPro tends to overexpose in my opinion. Test it out for yourself. Sometimes minus 0.5 is enough. Sharpness. I'll bring sharpness down to medium. High is just too much for my taste. Some people even prefer low. ISO max. I'll bring this down to 800. Above that, the image gets too noisy in my opinion. Color. I'll change color to flat because I'll add color and contrast later if need be in my editing software. If you don't want to deal with color correction later, you could leave this set to GoPro color. It's up to you. TimeWarp settings. Let's just go over a few settings in the TimeWarp preset. Resolution. I'll change the resolution from 1080 to 4K because I like having the highest resolution possible. Speed. Next is speed. You can set it to auto and GoPro picks the desired speed, or you can set it to a specific value from 2x all the way up to 30x. The faster the speed, the faster the TimeWarp looks played back. So for short activities, use a lower speed. For long activities, use a higher speed. EV comp. Like I usually do, I'll bring EV comp down to -1 so that my image is not overexposed, like the GoPro tends to do. Sharpness. I'll bring sharpness down to medium. High is just too much for my taste. Some people even prefer low. ISO max. I'll bring ISO max down to 800. Above that, the image gets too noisy in my opinion. Color. I'll change color to flat because I'll add color and contrast later if need be in my editing software. If you don't want to deal with color correction later, you could leave this set to GoPro color. It's up to you. White balance. I'll set white balance to 5500K if I'm shooting outdoors in sunlight. I'll leave it to auto if I'm shooting in other circumstances where I don't know the color temperature of my lighting sources. Zoom. I'll keep my zoom set to 1x. No reason to digitally zoom in. It lowers the video quality. I can do it later and edit if need be. If you're not editing your GoPro clips, feel free to zoom in. Night lapse settings. Let's take a look at some night lapse preset settings and adjust them as needed by tapping the pencil icon. Resolution. First, I'm going to adjust the resolution. I'm going to switch to 4K because it's a higher resolution than 1080. Format. Next, I'll adjust the format to photo and set your output setting to RAW. Night interval. Night interval can be set to auto if you want your GoPro to decide how often you want it to take a time-lapse photo. If you want to control this setting, you can go as long as 60 minutes or as often as every 5 seconds or something in between. If I'm shooting stars or night landscapes, I usually go with a night interval of 30 seconds. Bitrate. For the best quality, I always change bitrate to high. White balance. As far as setting white balance for shooting at night, you can change it to 5500 for a natural look, or you can cool it down to 3200 if you want a very blue look when shooting stars or landscapes at night. It's a creative choice. You can also just leave it on auto if you want your GoPro to make the decision. Color. As I usually do, I'll set color to flat. If you prefer a more saturated, high contrast look, go with GoPro. Sharpness. I'll turn sharpness down to medium for a more natural look. Some people even prefer low. Now I'm happy with this preset. Let's move on. Time-lapse photo workflow using Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Premiere Pro. Now I'll show you how to turn your raw GoPro individual photos into time-lapse videos using Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Premiere Pro. After moving your GoPro footage onto your computer, In Adobe Photoshop, open all of the .gpr GoPro RAW files that are part of your time lapse. You do this by selecting all of them and then click Open. Photoshop opens all of the images in Camera Raw. In the film strip, select one of the files and then press Command and A at the same time. This selects all of the raw images at once, so the changes you make to one are repeated on all of the other raw photos. Then adjust the raw settings to make the image look the best that it can. I will raise my shadows so that the trees have more detail. I'll also add a little more color using the saturation control. I'm going to bring up my exposure a little bit. Then I'll bring my highlights down a tad to preserve details in the clouds. Finally, when I'm happy with my tweaks, I'll click Save Images. This brings up save options. Now that our raw photos look good, we're going to turn them into high-quality JPEGs so that we can bring them into Adobe Premiere Pro. Under Destination, I'll click on Select Folder, and then I'll create a new folder on my computer's hard drive where I want my new JPEGs to be saved. Then I'll click Select. Next, under Format, I'll make sure that we are set to JPEG and that our quality is set to the highest level, 12. Then I will press Save. Camera Raw will create JPEGs from our tweaked RAW files. When that process is done, open Adobe Premiere Pro. Create a sequence that is UHD with a frame rate of 23.976. Then, in an empty bin, right-click and choose Import. Next, navigate to the folder that has your new JPEGs in it. Make sure that the JPEGs are in sequential order. I'll select the first one, the lowest number, then I'll click Options and make sure that Image Sequence is checked. Next, I'll click Import. Premiere Pro puts all those individual files into one clip. I'll drag and drop the time-lapse clip onto my timeline. Because the resolution of the time-lapse clip is higher than UHD, I can go into the Effects tab and scale it down. This is great for reframing and doing moves like zooming in. Finally, I'll render the time-lapse clip on the timeline and play it back. It looks great. Feel free to export it any way you please. Well, I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.